Growing up, I was the kind of kid that everyone in school had a word for, and that word was nerd. Now, before you tell me that being a nerd is considered cool these days, I already know that. I hear people say it all the time. They wear it like a badge they earned, like it means something worth bragging about, and honestly, good for them. But where I came from, in the era I grew up in, being called a nerd was nothing short of a daily gut punch. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't ironic. It was a declaration that you were below the social food chain, and the kids above you on that chain were more than willing to remind you of it. Physically, if they had to. High school back then operated on a completely different set of rules than it does today. You could get shoved into a locker for listening to the wrong band. You could get humiliated in front of a hallway full of students just because you preferred reading to watching whatever game was on that Friday night. It sounds like something pulled straight out of an 80s coming-of-age film, and I get that. But I'm not writing this to be dramatic. I'm writing it because every word of it is true. And because the worst of it all came during one very specific school year, junior year. Junior year was the year Steve decided to make our lives miserable. Steve was the kind of person who needed an audience for everything he did. He wasn't satisfied unless people were watching him, talking about him, or reacting to him in some way. For my small circle of friends and me, he was relentless. He tormented us in the hallways, in class, at lunch. It didn't matter where we were. If he could get a reaction out of us, he would chase that reaction to the ends of the earth. Looking back now as an adult, I understand that kind of behavior usually comes from somewhere deep and painful. But as a teenager just trying to survive junior year, Steve was pure misery in a Letterman jacket. Toward the very end of that school year, Steve cooked up what he apparently believed was the greatest plan of his life. He decided he was going to break into the school at night and pull off an elaborate prank. No real reason, no real motive other than the desperate, burning need to prove to everyone around him just how fearless and untouchable he was. He wanted people to talk about it. He wanted the legend of it to outlast him. So one night he broke in and he got caught. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what happened to Steve, and more importantly, what ended up happening to my friends and me because of what Steve started, I need to give you the full picture of the school itself. The school is closed now, has been for years, but in its time it was one of the more prominent private schools in the area. It had a reputation. We wore uniforms. We attended church services during school hours. The administration had standards, and they made sure every student knew what those standards were. From the outside, it looked like the kind of school that old families sent their kids to, the kind of place with tradition built into every brick. And that's a fitting way to describe it, because the bricks were very, very old. Before it became a school in the 1950s, the building had been a hospital, specifically a hospital for the severely ill, tuberculosis patients. People suffering from diseases that the medicine of that era had little to no answer for. When the construction crews came in during the conversion and started breaking up sections of the ground, they made a discovery that would quietly define the identity of that school for every generation of students that followed. They found bones, a significant number of skeletal remains buried beneath the surface, bodies of people who had died from tuberculosis and other illnesses, disposed of not through any formal burial process, but through necessity and fear, because the risk of infection spreading was so severe. Hospital workers had reportedly used an underground tunnel, one that connected the main hospital building to a secondary structure nearby, as a place to move and discard the dead. Out of sight, out of reach, out of mind. Now, whether every detail of that story was historically accurate or embellished over decades of retelling is something I genuinely cannot confirm. What I can tell you is that by the time my friends and I were walking those hallways, that story had taken on a life of its own. It had become local legend. It was the kind of thing older kids told younger kids on the first week of school, the kind of story that got passed down like a torch from one graduating class to the next. Nobody questioned it. Nobody needed to. The school looked the part, ancient, imposing, full of long shadows and strange sounds that echoed through hallways long after the last teacher had gone home. The rumors of hauntings were constant. Strange noises in the walls, unexplained footsteps in empty corridors, cold spots that appeared and vanished without any logical source. The standard response from every student was always the same. A shrug and a casual, "Oh, that's just the ghosts." The rational explanation, of course, is that a building that old and that poorly maintained is going to make noise. Pipes shift. Walls settle. Old wood does what old wood does. But rational explanations don't travel as fast as ghost stories. And ghost stories were the native language of that school. Now, back to Steve. The night Steve broke in, He did everything with the maximum amount of theatrical chaos he could manage. He tore through classrooms, flipped desks, scattered papers across every surface he could reach. He made his way to the library and cleared entire shelves onto the floor, sending hundreds of books sprawling across the carpet. And then, because subtlety was never Steve's strong suit, he found his way to the art room, cracked open a container of red paint, and began writing messages across the lockers in the main hallway, classic horror movie language. The kind of thing a person writes when they've watched too many slasher films and not enough of anything else. Get out. Your soul is next, and the one that stuck with everyone for weeks after. Death is coming. Dramatic? Absolutely. Stupid? Without question. But here's the part that changed everything. Steve claimed that while he was finishing up his little masterpiece on those lockers, he heard something. Not a creak from the building settling. Not the hum of a ventilation system. Something that came from below. From the basement. He said he walked to the basement door and stood there at the top of the staircase, looking down into the darkness beneath him. And what he saw, or what he claimed to see, were shadows. Shadows that moved the way shadows aren't supposed to move. Independent of any light source, shifting and sliding along the walls below in ways he couldn't explain. And underneath the movement of those shadows, he heard voices, rising from somewhere deep in the dark beneath him. He said it didn't sound like whispering between two people. He said it sounded like something else entirely, something that didn't belong to a living person. Whatever Steve saw or heard at the top of that staircase scared him badly enough to make him run. And when Steve ran, he left evidence everywhere. Paint-covered fingerprints on the locker doors, his handwriting plain as day across the walls. The investigation that followed was brief because it didn't need to be long. The school expelled him within the week. What I remember most clearly is the sound of Steve screaming as he was being removed from the principal's office. Not crying, not begging, screaming. Going on and on about something evil in that basement. Something that had been down there. Something that had seen him standing at the top of those stairs. The school moved on quickly. Steve did not. And the student body, as student bodies tend to do, turned Steve into a martyr almost overnight. Suddenly he was brave. Suddenly he had survived something. People were genuinely saying with completely straight faces that Steve had come within inches of his life that night, that the evil spirits in the basement had nearly claimed him. I am not exaggerating. These were real conversations happening in real classrooms among real human teenagers. My friends and I found it insulting on multiple levels. We were convinced Steve had invented the basement story entirely, that it was a last-ditch attempt to spin his vandalism into something legendary before the expulsion paperwork was signed. He had gotten exactly what he deserved, and somehow the school had transformed him into a folk hero for it. The injustice of it sat with all of us for weeks, which is probably why I made the suggestion I made. On the last day of school, I proposed that we do what Steve had done, but better. Quieter, smarter, and most importantly, without getting caught. We would break into the school, go down to the basement, walk through every inch of it, and prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that there was nothing supernatural down there. No ghosts, no evil spirits. No restless souls of tuberculosis victims rising from a century-old tunnel. Just an old basement full of old junk. And in doing so, we would prove definitively that Steve had lied, that his screaming in the hallway was a performance, and that the legend everyone was so eager to believe was nothing but dust and bad lighting. My friends agreed without much hesitation. The plan was clean and simple. Get inside, reach the basement, confirm it was just a basement, and get out before anyone knew we had been there. No property damage, no red paint, no dramatic messages left behind. We were going to do this the right way. And we had an advantage Steve never had. My friend Carson's mother was a janitor at the school. She had a key to the back door. Carson quietly borrowed it without her knowledge, and on the last night of the school year, the four of us walked right through the back entrance without so much as a raised voice or a broken window. We dressed for it. Sweatpants, hooded jackets pulled up over our heads like we had spent the previous week watching heist movies and absorbing lessons about criminal fashion. We each carried a flashlight, the cheap kind, dollar store quality, the kind that turns yellow at the edges and throws more shadow than light. But they were what we had, and they were going to have to be enough. Stepping inside the school after dark hit differently than any of us were prepared for. I don't care how old you are or how logical you consider yourself, walking into your school at night, when the hallways that are normally filled with hundreds of voices are absolutely silent, does something to the part of your brain that never fully grew up. The lockers looked wrong in the dark. The classroom doors seemed closer together. The ceiling felt lower. None of that was real, obviously. But it felt real, and that's the part that matters when your heartbeat is already running ahead of you. We reached the basement door. It was unremarkable. Heavy, wooden, with a round metal handle. Carson grabbed it and pulled it open. What waited on the other side was a staircase that dropped down into a darkness so thick it seemed almost physical. Our flashlights cut into it, but only barely. The beams hit a few feet of dusty wooden stairs and then seemed to dissolve before reaching the bottom. Carson went first. The rest of us followed close enough that we were nearly stepping on each other's heels. The basement was enormous. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the smell, not the cold, not the rows of old storage boxes stacked against every wall, but the sheer size of the space. It felt like it went on far longer than the building above it should have allowed. Our flashlights couldn't reach the far end of the room from where we were standing. The beams just faded out in the middle of the open air, swallowed by the dark before they could touch the opposite wall. We walked. We looked through boxes. Old textbooks with cracked spines. Christmas decorations in torn cardboard. Extra school uniforms still wrapped in dry cleaning plastic. The further we moved into the basement, the more it began to feel like walking through a graveyard of things the school had decided were no longer worth looking at. And lining the walls between the stacks of boxes were the religious statues. Tall ones, short ones, some cracked, some missing limbs, all of them staring at nothing with expressions that were somewhere between serenity and judgment. I have always had a thing about old religious statues in dark places. I know that's specific. I know it probably sounds strange, but something about the combination of carved stone faces, deep shadow, and complete silence turns my stomach in a way that nothing else quite manages. We kept moving. Eventually, in one of the far corners of the basement, the part that felt noticeably colder than the rest of the room, the kind of cold that doesn't come from an open window but seems to rise from the floor itself, we found something. After moving a few boxes out of the way, we were looking at a hole in the wall. Not a doorway, not a vent, a hole. Roughly the size of a large beach ball, maybe slightly larger. Small enough that a person would have to get on their hands and knees to pass through it, but absolutely large enough to fit a person crawling on their hands and knees. Carson wanted to go in immediately. The rest of us said no. Instead, we crouched down and aimed our flashlights through the opening. The beam went in, traveled a few feet, and then the tunnel swallowed it. It's beyond darkness. The walls were close. The ceiling of the tunnel was low, and the air that came back out of that hole was the coldest air I had felt all night. We stood there for a moment and all arrived at the same silent conclusion. This was the tunnel. The one from the stories. The one they had used to move the bodies. Carson said we had to go in. If we were really here to prove there was nothing, we had to check the one spot that mattered. After a brief argument that nobody fully won, we settled it with rock, paper, scissors. 3 rounds. I lost every single one. I got on my hands and knees, flashlight gripped in my right hand, and I started to crawl. I made it maybe 4 or 5 feet before I stopped. Something had changed in the air. Not the temperature, the sound. There was a sound in the tunnel ahead of me that hadn't been there a moment before. I held completely still and listened. My friends, still outside the hole, started laughing because they assumed I had already given up. I told them to be quiet. I told them I had heard something and needed silence to hear it again. The sound came back. The only word I have ever been able to land on to describe it is whooshing, not like wind moving through a space, but something else, something that had rhythm and intention, like something breathing at a frequency slightly below the range of normal breathing. I called out into the darkness ahead of me. Nothing. The whooshing shifted. It changed, and slowly, over the course of maybe 10 or 15 seconds, it began to sound like whispering. Not words I could identify, not a voice I could assign to a person, just the shape and texture of whispering rising up from somewhere further down the tunnel. It grew louder, and then it stopped completely. My friends were asking me what was happening. I couldn't answer them. I crawled forward. 2 feet, maybe 3. My flashlight beam moved with me, sliding across the low tunnel walls, the packed earth of the ceiling, the ground beneath my hands. And then the beam caught something that made every muscle in my body lock at once. 15 feet ahead of me, crouched in the narrow space of the tunnel with its back slightly curved to fit beneath the low ceiling, was a person. The word person feels almost too generous for what I was looking at. It had the shape of one. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a torso. But everything else about it defied any comfortable definition. The skin was pale in a way that had nothing to do with light. The frame was skeletal, almost impossibly thin. I could see the architecture of the ribcage pressing outward from beneath the skin like fingers pushing through a sheet. There was no shirt, no visible clothing on the upper body. The hair was matted and long and fell in clumps across the sides of the face. And the eyes, God, the eyes when were open and completely vacant. Not closed. Not afraid. Not even particularly reactive to the beam of my flashlight hitting directly across them. Just open, half-lidded, staring at something that wasn't me and wasn't anything in that tunnel. I asked if it was okay. I heard my own voice shake in a way I had never heard before. It didn't move. I started crawling backward. That's when it lunged, not forward in a run. Not in any movement that resembled a normal human being scrambling toward someone. It came at me in that same crouched, folded-up position, moving through the tunnel at a speed that made no sense, making a sound that I cannot describe, and have never been able to put a name to in any conversation I have had in the years since. It was guttural and rhythmic and completely, deeply wrong. Getting backward through a narrow tunnel while trying to keep a flashlight aimed forward at something moving toward you through. The dark is the closest I have ever come to fully losing control of my own body. My arms and legs were moving on pure survival signal. My brain had checked out of the conversation entirely. I burst out of the hole and barely got to my feet before my friends saw it, the figure crawling through the hole after me, one hand reaching out from the darkness, grabbing at the air near my ankle. We ran, all four of us, up the stairs, through the basement door, down the hallway, out the back entrance, and we did not stop running until we were blocks away from the school. When we finally stopped, out of breath and shaking, nobody spoke for almost a minute. Then Carson said what all of us were thinking. What was that? The explanation I landed on that night is the same one I have stood behind for every year since. The tunnel must exit somewhere. A sewer system, a storm drain, some point above ground where a person could have found their way in. What we encountered was most likely a homeless person or someone in the grip of a severe mental health or substance crisis who had been using that tunnel as shelter. Someone who had been living there possibly for a long time, hidden beneath a private school that had never thought to check whether the old hospital tunnel was still accessible from the outside. It's a logical answer. It's the most grounded answer available, and I believe it. But I have never been able to get past the eyes. In everything I have seen, in every face I have looked into, in every memory I can access. I have never seen eyes like that before, and I have never seen anything close to them since. Empty isn't the right word. Absent isn't either. There was something in those eyes that didn't match anything I knew how to categorize, and I have been carrying that for a long time. When the school shut down years later, I thought about that night. I thought about the tunnel. I thought about whatever was living in it. And wherever that person is now, whether they found their way somewhere safer, whether the demolition of that building pushed them out into the world, or whether they were something else entirely that I will never fully understand, I genuinely hope they found peace. The shadows may be fading, but the fear will stay with you long after this story ends. Don't forget to like, subscribe,